Welcome to Teaching Strategies for Social Sciences by Amber Doremus. The first thing that we need to establish are what are social sciences. They're primarily broken into three parts: understanding people and cultures. This is going to include classes like history, social studies, sociology, humanities, political science, and anthropology. Then you have quantitative research like economics and statistics classes. These are primarily going to be math-based classes. The last category would be presentation classes like communications and speech. These really make students interact with their peers and they're actually presenting material, usually in front of the class. I know that this can feel a little bit overwhelming because we're dealing with a lot of different classes, but we're going to address that problem a little bit later. The first type of instruction that we want to look at is called direct or explicit teaching. Now, the most popular way to do this is to look at the I do, we do, you do model, in which a teacher will do the activity first, then they will do an activity with the students, and then the student is required to do that activity independently. Now, this has a lot of great things going for it, but it also has some cons. One of the greatest parts is it's very systematic and it's very easily understood by students. It's teaching very explicit things. We're telling the student this is why it's important that you learn this particular skill or information. Unfortunately, it does work best in learning specific concepts or skills. It actually can limit students' critical thinking skills, and as we know, those critical thinking skills are very important when teaching the social sciences. The next type of learning that we want to look at is called drill and practice. Now, this is a systematic repetition of information. You don't see it a lot in the social sciences. You're more likely to see it on something like a spelling test, where students are given the word and then they repeat it over and over until it becomes a part of memory. It does help students develop specific sets of skills, but usually not towards the social sciences. Again, we're seeing that it doesn't allow for critical thinking. The next model that we want to look at is the traditional lecture hall. Now, this is where the teacher or professor stands in front of the class and can drone on and on about the subject ad nauseum. Now, there are some pros. It's a great way to give a lot of information to a large group of people very quickly. It also lets us have that shared vocabulary that we need to learn. However, it can easily become boring and students can really disconnect from the material. Now, I think that lectures get a really bad rap. I think that there's a lot of positives that can be done within the lecture. The problem is oftentimes it's overused. Now that we've looked at the more traditional ways of teaching, I want to look at some more innovative ways. We're going to start with problem-based learning. Now, this is really interesting because they tend to use personal and real-life experiences to really connect students and have that really high student engagement. If they're talking about something that affects the student, they're obviously going to be paying more attention. Now, one of the major cons that I see with this is it assumes a lot of prior knowledge for students to be engaged, and it doesn't allow for that common vocabulary and common language between students to get started. Another problem that I can see with this is the example of a homeless student. If you're dealing with homelessness as your problem, it can really hit home for them. On topics like abortion, gun control, religion, it can really be a hot button topic that maybe your class isn't prepared for. The next thing I want to talk about is discovery learning, which is also called inquiry-based learning. Now, this is really innovative and it can be very interesting in the classroom. What you do is you start off with a main topic and then you allow the students to really branch off and see where it goes. Now, getting the curriculum all folded back in and making it work can be a little bit on the difficult side, but done correctly, you have very high student engagement. The students want to learn more. You're actually taking questions that they give you to lead the next topic. Again, one of the big cons is it's very easy to get off track. Another model that we want to look at is called self-guided learning. Now, this is really similar to the discovery learning that we talked about before. With this, though, it's very much guided by the student and their goals and their expectations, and sometimes even the way we grade is based on what the student is giving us. Now, again, You're going to see very high student engagement, which is amazing. But unfortunately, this can be very hard to monitor, and self-efficacy is needed. Now, self-efficacy is really the student believing that they have the ability to learn and to learn on their own. Some students, especially in the junior high and high school levels, aren't ready for this responsibility. The next thing I want to talk about is project-based learning. Now, this is a very interesting thing because usually when we teach, it's in very small clumps. In project-based learning, we're really going in depth with a subject, and that project might last a semester. It might even last the entire year. Now, this can be great because obviously a lot of learning can be done in that amount of time, and we can really dig deep into those subjects. Unfortunately, with any long-term project, you find students that are unmotivated. You're going to have students that, especially working in groups, might have conflicts. With shorter projects, we have the ability to kind of shake those up, move groups around where it makes sense for our students. In a long-term project like that, that's not possible. I also worry about students falling behind. If a student were to fall behind, it can be harder for this type of project for them to catch up. So now that we have a shared vocabulary, we understand what classes we're talking about, we understand the different types of teaching that we can do, we have to ask ourselves what's missing in this research. Well, the first thing that I see missing is the teacher disposition and attitude. Now, this plays a lot into the research that I did because a lot of these research methods, they just looked at what type of teaching was happening. Are they using a lecture? Are they using group work? They weren't really looking at the teacher themselves. And as we know, teachers are very different. One might be really ineffective at giving lectures. They speak in a monotone voice that puts their students to sleep. They don't use examples that connect with the students, while another teacher, sometimes even in the same building, can be very effective at giving lectures. We didn't really look at how effective the teachers were at each category. We just looked at the category as a whole. I think this is a big mistake. Another problem that I see is dealing with classroom culture. Each classroom is going to be different. Their goals are going to be different. How they deal with things are going to be different. We have to take this into account when we look at our students. The next problem is the complex nature of social sciences. We have classes that are more math-based. We have classes that are dealing with giving speeches in public. We are dealing with policy. We're dealing with a lot of different classes in the social sciences, and this research really didn't take into account all the different things that we have to teach. It might be really effective for a class to use an example in the I do, you do, we do direct teaching model if we're learning something like how to do a math problem in our economics class. That same model might not be effective if we're teaching how to give a speech. We really need to look at the individual ways that each lesson needs to be taught. The last thing I think that a lot of this research doesn't take into account is the mixed approach. A lot of teachers aren't going to use just one method through the entire year, but looking at the research, you wouldn't know that. Teachers tend to be very varied in how they give out information. Lesson 1 might have a vocabulary lesson that needs to be taught a certain way. Lesson 2 might not have so much vocabulary. It might be a hands-on learning project, and that's how they want to give that information. A lot of teachers are going to mix things up. This research really doesn't show that. So how do we get to a point where our classroom doesn't look like this? Number 1, we need to be flexible and understand not all lessons are going to be taught exactly the same. One method isn't going to carry us through the entire school year. We need to use a varied approach. Number 2, we need to be wise. We need to understand that some lessons just lend themselves better to certain models than others. We need to do what's right for students. Each class is going to be different. We need to figure out what's going to work for that class. Good luck and happy teaching!